Look at this map visualizing historical Christian expansion. It represents the traditional view of missions, plural. We usually define this work as strictly geographical and evangelistic tasks, like crossing oceans or planting churches in new territories. Defining the work solely through geography and conversion limits the church's function. The focus shifts to spiritual extraction, prioritizing personal salvation for a future state, while the current world becomes a secondary backdrop. This creates a theological vacuum. If the ultimate goal is spiritual extraction from a doomed planet, the church lacks a logical reason to care about the physical world we live in right now. Physical, real-world actions like famine relief, local ecological care, and fighting for systemic social justice end up categorized as secondary concerns or ignored completely. Old Testament scholar Christopher J.H. Wright identifies the root of this problem. He identifies a gap between missions, the specific, plural tasks believers undertake, and mission, the singular, overarching purpose of God. Confusing individual assignments with that ultimate divine purpose limits the church's mandate. It isolates believers from the physical reality they are meant to inhabit. We often assume the early church spread across the globe purely because Jesus gave them a direct command, like the Great Commission. But these early, primarily Jewish Christians were reading a story. They saw themselves as active characters fulfilling an ancient, ongoing prophetic narrative that demanded the inclusion of all nations. Recognizing your specific placement within a grand, continuous story provides a far more powerful catalyst for action than simply obeying a static rule. Wright argues that the early church's reading of Scripture reveals a specific architecture. This architecture organizes the biblical narrative into 4 distinct stages: creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. Act 1 is creation. The biblical narrative establishes the physical world as intrinsically valuable from the start, which makes ecological stewardship an original, divine mandate. Act 2 is the fall. Wright defines sin as a pervasive brokenness that infects large-scale global structures, stretching far beyond isolated individual mistakes. In Act 3, redemption, we trace a historical effort to restore those fractured systems, weaving through the history of Israel and pulling the pieces back into alignment through Christ. Finally, the story points to a new creation. The anticipation here, drawn from Revelation 22, is a physically restored reality rather than a disembodied escape. This structure demonstrates that God's mission is the total reclamation of the physical world. This expands the scope of what Christians are actually supposed to be doing. To see how this narrative applies to a tangible, everyday situation, consider a local community garden project. Planting seeds and growing vegetables for families in need integrates ecological care, relationship building, and local justice into a single, cohesive effort. Simple acts of care represent a direct engagement with God's restorative story. A community garden becomes a localized expression of the larger cosmic effort to reclaim the physical world. Critics raise a valid tension. If everything counts as mission, does evangelism lose its urgency? Look at this solar system model representing Wright's response. Evangelism serves as the central node, the crux of the mission, but it is not the entirety of the system. The spiritual message and the physical, social restoration are inseparable, locked in a necessary orbit. Living out what is called the whole gospel requires a unified identity. It demands integrity and transformation from the church, proving that the mission requires a multifaceted people. We often think of the church as the owner of its goals, but the hierarchy is reversed. The church exists as an instrument of God's overarching purpose. Every act of teaching, every moment of healing, and every fight for justice is active participation in one singular objective. God is reclaiming all of creation, and we are invited to help rebuild it.